The highway is barely awake, just a thin line of gray cutting across open land, the kind of quiet you only get right before sunrise. For a moment, nothing moves. Then you hear it, a low, rolling growl that feels like it's coming from deep inside the pavement. It's rough, a little uneven, and full of old anger. Not the polished hum of modern cars. Something older, something heavier. Out of the haze, the shape begins to appear. Wide front fenders, a long nose, a stance that looks almost confrontational. The 1970 Dodge Charger moves through the morning light like it knows this road belongs to it. You can almost feel the weight of the steel, the vibration under your chest, the deep echo of an era when American engines didn't apologize for anything. The sun hits the chrome just right, giving the car a thin, warm edge. Not shiny, more like a scar glowing under light. The body lines aren't trying to be pretty. They're bold, stubborn, carved into something that still demands respect 50 years later. This wasn't a car built to blend in. It was built to announce itself. And in 1970, it was one of the last machines allowed to be that unapologetic. There's something about seeing a Charger like this that doesn't feel like nostalgia. It feels like memory trying to climb out of the past. I remember the first time I stood next to one. I must have been 12, maybe 13. There was this older guy in our neighborhood, the kind who always smelled like gasoline and old leather jackets. He kept a faded B5 Blue 70 Charger tucked inside a garage that looked too small for it. Most days, the car slept under a cracked tarp, dust settling gently on the rear fenders. One afternoon, he decided to fire it up. I was close enough to see him pump the pedal twice, turn the key, and lean back slightly like he already knew what was coming. The engine didn't start. It detonated into life. The whole garage shook. My stomach dropped. I had no idea cars could sound like they were announcing their existence to the world. And for a moment, just a moment, that car felt alive. That sound etched itself into my memory deeper than anything else from that age. Sorry, we drifted off for a second. So let's get back to the main point. We were talking about how the 1970 Charger became the last pure muscle icon before everything changed. That raw attitude wasn't just styling or horsepower. The 1970 Charger carried something bigger. The final moment before new rules, new fears, and new priorities shut the door on wide-open American horsepower. It was built right at the edge of a turning point, and somehow that made it stronger, louder, and more symbolic than anything Dodge produced before or after. But to understand why 1970 became the peak, the last full breath before the fall, we need to go back to where the Charger first came from and how it climbed into the center of America's muscle car war. When you look back at the early 1960s, it almost feels like stepping into a calmer America. The roads were wider, the air felt different, and cars carried a weight you could almost sense through the photos. You can almost hear that low, steady hum those highways must have had back then. And in the middle of all that, Dodge was still trying to figure out what it wanted to become. At that time, Dodge wasn't seen as an exciting brand. Their cars did the job, lasted long, and made sense for families, but they didn't spark anything inside you. And if you picture those showrooms from that era, you can almost feel that missing energy. People walked in, but the cars didn't pull them in emotionally. Inside Dodge, that feeling must have been obvious. Designers and engineers could see what GM and Ford were doing, and you could almost sense the pressure building behind closed doors. Everyone knew the younger generation wanted cars that felt alive, cars that spoke through their shape, their sound, their attitude. That push led to the B-body platform. It wasn't flashy, but it gave Dodge something it didn't have before, a strong foundation for a real performance car. You can almost feel the shift starting here. Finally, Dodge had the structure for something bold. Then came the 1966 Charger. Long, fastback roof, hidden headlights, a look that said Dodge was ready to take risks. Even if it wasn't perfect, you can picture people stopping for a second look. And sometimes, that second look is where momentum begins. But 1968, that's when everything changed. The 1968 Charger didn't just look confident, it felt confident. The Coke bottle shape, the aggressive stance, the way it sat on the road, you can almost feel that design in your chest. Even today, standing next to a 68 gives you this quiet, grounded feeling, like the car understands the era it came from. And then came Bullitt. The Charger wasn't the hero car, but it carried this undeniable presence. You can almost sense the audience paying more attention to the Charger than the storyline. Something about its weight, its movement, it connected with people. By 1969, Dodge finally had the identity it had been chasing. The Charger became a symbol, not just a car. Teenagers noticed it. Street racers respected it. Families admired it. You can imagine the pride inside Dodge at that point, finally feeling like they belonged in the muscle conversation. But under all that excitement, something else was building. Insurance companies were raising rates. Emissions talk was starting. Safety rules were tightening. It wasn't dramatic yet, but you could feel the era starting to tighten, slowly. And right in that narrow window, Dodge built the 1970 Charger. What makes the 1970 model so meaningful is the moment it was born in. You can sense the urgency in the design. It's not shouting for attention. It's refining everything Dodge had learned, almost like a final, focused step before the world changed. The loop-style grille feels deliberate. The full-width taillight panel feels confident. The high-impact colors don't feel loud, they feel alive. Plum crazy, Hemi orange, top banana. You can almost picture these cars glowing in regular traffic. And the engine stayed true to what made the Charger special. The 383 remained solid. The 440 stayed powerful and honest. The six-pack delivered that sudden rush. And the Hemi, well, even thinking about it, you can almost hear that uneven, cold idle. But here's what gives the 1970 Charger its emotional weight: the timing. This wasn't just another model year. It was Dodge's last chance to build a muscle car without restrictions pulling it every direction. When you stand next to a 1970 Charger today, you can feel that in the metal. It's not dramatic, and it's not exaggerated. It's just there. A quiet sense that this was the last year American muscle felt completely unrestricted. You get the feeling of a car shaped by instinct rather than rule books. A car designed before the industry had to apologize for power. A car built while the era still felt wide open. And that's why the 1970 Charger matters more than most people realize. It stands right at the edge of the fall, close enough to feel the shift, but still untouched by it. Before we move into the development story, the people behind the design, the engineering fights, the late-night testing, it's important to understand this moment clearly. The 1970 Charger wasn't built in a normal year. It was built in the last moment when American muscle still felt limitless. The story of how the 1970 Dodge Charger was developed isn't just a timeline of engineering decisions. It's the story of a small group of people trying to get one last pure muscle machine out the door before the world changed around them. You can almost imagine the atmosphere inside Dodge's Highland Park offices during those late 1960s years. There's excitement, sure, but also a quiet awareness that the window for building a car like this is shrinking a little more each season. Dodge had momentum from the 68 and 69 Chargers, and you can almost feel how much that energy mattered. The brand finally had something that resonated, a shape that caught people's attention, a sound people remembered, a reputation that felt earned rather than marketed. And when a team feels that kind of momentum, the work takes on a different tone. Inside the engineering rooms, the designers were already thinking ahead. The 68 redesign had hit big, but they knew it wasn't the end. You can picture the clay models sitting under bright studio lights, engineers walking around them with quiet focus, sketch lines taped along the fenders. Everyone knew they weren't here to reinvent, they were here to refine. One of the key figures behind the Charger's performance direction was Herb Porter, an engineer who had been involved in Chrysler's racing programs. Porter had this practical way of thinking, not flashy, not loud, just grounded. And you can almost sense how important that grounded approach was when you're dealing with engines like the Hemi and the 440. Muscle cars weren't subtle machines. They needed someone who understood how to balance aggression with reliability. At the same time, Larry Rathgeb, known for his influence on the Charger Daytona program, brought aerodynamic awareness to the table. He wasn't directly reshaping the 1970 model cosmetically, but his understanding of airflow had changed the way Dodge thought about big-bodied muscle cars. You can almost picture him leaning over drawings, adjusting tiny angles that might give the Charger a little more stability. The Daytona had shown what was possible when Dodge got serious, and that confidence trickled into the regular Charger lineup. The 1970 model wasn't meant to be a race car, but it was shaped by the lessons Dodge learned from trying to win at 200 miles per hour. Dodge didn't want a full redesign. That was planned for 1971. Instead, they wanted to give the 1970 model a sharper identity, something subtle but noticeable. And that's why the loop-style grille was such a key decision. If you've ever stood in front of a 1970 Charger, you know what that grille feels like. It's clean, simple, less aggressive than the 69 split grille, but somehow more confident. You can almost sense the designers stepping back from the clay model and nodding, knowing they've found the right balance. The rear design was just as deliberate. The full-width taillight wasn't designed to shout. It was designed to hold the car's width visually. And it works. When the lights glow, the entire back end feels unified. You can almost picture the designers turning the lights on in a dark studio for the first time and seeing that long horizontal glow. But behind the styling was the real soul of the Charger, the engines. The 383 Magnum stayed because it worked. Simple, reliable, torquey. The kind of engine that didn't need bragging rights to feel honest. The 440 Magnum, though, was a different animal. You can almost feel the weight of it, not literally, but in how it pulls. The engineers knew how popular it had become. Inside Dodge, they had countless hours of test data showing just how consistent and responsive that engine was. And in a world before modern electronics, consistency mattered. A lot. But the 440 six-pack was the big decision for 1970. 3 Holley carbs sitting like a row of breathing lungs. It wasn't just an option, it was a statement. You can almost imagine the engineers fine-tuning those carbs on the dyno, adjusting mixtures, listening to the rhythm of the engine until it felt right. And then there was the 426 Hemi. The Hemi wasn't a casual engine. It wasn't built for people who wanted something comfortable. It was a race engine that Dodge somehow convinced the public to buy. Inside the engineering rooms, it must have felt surreal knowing they were selling something that shared its bloodline with NASCAR power plants. You can almost hear that uneven idle in your head, that deep thump-thump that sounds like a heartbeat with muscle behind it. The Hemi didn't change much for 1970 because it didn't need to. It already pushed the limits of what was realistic for a street car. The focus instead was on making the lineup accessible, a range of personalities inside one body shape. But something interesting was happening within Dodge during this period. The designers and engineers knew they weren't just working on a car, they were working against time. Regulations were coming, insurance companies were tightening, fuel concerns were whispering in the background. You can almost feel that slight tension under the surface. The freedom muscle cars enjoyed through the 60s wasn't going to last much longer. That's why the development of the 1970 Charger carries this emotional undertone. It's not loud or dramatic, it's subtle. A sense that Dodge wanted to finish something before moving into a stricter, more cautious era. Inside the studios, the high-impact colors were being finalized. Plum Crazy, Hemi Orange, Top Banana. These weren't normal paint choices. They were energy in color form. You can imagine how these colors must have looked under studio lights, almost glowing. Designers didn't add these colors for shock value. They added them because the era itself felt loud and expressive. Cars mirrored people, and people wanted personality. Even the smallest details, the rally gauges, the pistol grip shifter, the wheel options, were chosen with intention. You can almost picture designers running their hands across the leather grain texture, feeling the surface, imagining how it would feel on a long drive. But outside the studios, the real testing happened. Late-night runs on Woodward Avenue, quick blasts on the Chrysler Proving Grounds, engineers listening not to numbers, but to the way the car sounded and pulled. That's something you won't find on a blueprint. You can almost picture those nights. A group of tired engineers leaning against the fender, watching exhaust heat ripple in the cool air, making notes on clipboards. They weren't chasing perfection, they were chasing feeling. And that's what makes the 1970 Charger special. It was shaped by instincts, by pressure, by pride, by the last moment before everything changed. And by the time the car was finalized, Dodge knew exactly what they had. The last pure muscle version of the Charger before the fall. Digging into the hardware of the 1970 Dodge Charger gives you a clearer picture of why this car feels so different from other muscle machines of its era. The looks always get the attention first, but it's the engineering beneath the surface that gives the Charger its weight. Not physical weight, but emotional weight. You can almost sense that the car was built to satisfy both the numbers guys and the people who listen to engines more than they read brochures. The 1970 lineup opened with the 318 V8, the most modest engine of the bunch. It wasn't built to overpower anyone, but it had that familiar Chrysler reliability. If you've ever heard a 318 idle on a quiet morning, you know it has a soft rhythm. Not intimidating, not aggressive. It's the kind of engine that feels like a handshake more than a punch. But the story of the Charger's identity starts with a 383 Magnum. This engine sat right in the sweet spot. Not too tame, not too wild. It produced around 335 horsepower, but more importantly, it delivered power in a way that felt smooth and confident. You can almost hear that deep mid-range rumble that comes alive when the car climbs through second gear. It's a sound that makes you feel connected to the pavement without overwhelming you. Then there was the 440 Magnum, the power plant most people associate with street-friendly brutality. With 375 horsepower and torque that felt like it arrived the moment your foot touched the pedal, the 440 had this distinct personality. You can almost imagine what it felt like for first-time owners. That moment when the car leans back slightly and the world outside the windows stretches just a little. The 440 six-pack version was where Dodge decided to have some fun. 3 Holley two-barrel carburetors sitting like 3 lungs feeding a massive chest. The factory rating was 390 horsepower, but everyone knew that number was conservative. You can almost sense the excitement of engineers during dyno tests when all 3 carbs opened up at once. There's something almost animal-like in the way a six-pack breathes when it's pushed. And then there was the 426 Hemi, the engine that didn't need introduction back then and doesn't need one now. Street Hemi, dual quads, massive cylinder heads, and a compression ratio that made the engine feel like it was constantly ready for a fight. The Hemi wasn't smooth in the traditional sense. It shook a little, it idled rough, it barked through the exhaust, but that's exactly why people loved it. Even imagining that cold idle gives you a sense of how alive the car felt. But engines are only part of the story. The Charger's personality also comes from its chassis. Built on the B-body platform, the car carried a weight that you could actually feel in the way it handled. The suspension wasn't delicate or overly tuned. It was solid, almost stubborn. Torsion bars in the front, leaf springs in the rear. It wasn't meant to glide. It was meant to hold its ground. People sometimes forget that muscle cars weren't designed to be corner carvers. They were meant to go straight with confidence, and the Charger embraced that. You can almost picture the way the car squatted under throttle, planting its weight before pushing forward. It's a behavior you recognize instantly if you've ever watched one launch. Transmission options shaped the driving feel as well. The 3-speed TorqueFlite automatic was durable and smooth, almost unbreakable. The 4-speed manual, paired with the pistol grip shifter, felt like a conversation between driver and machine. You can imagine the click-clack sound of that shifter sliding through gates. It has a mechanical honesty modern cars don't replicate. The 1970 Charger wasn't chasing lap times, it was chasing character. Even the brakes and steering reflect the era. Power steering made the car manageable, but it still had that little bit of play that reminds you this is a machine with weight. Drum brakes on many trims meant planning your stops, which today might sound inconvenient, but back then it simply felt normal. Everything about the hardware reminds you of a time when drivers were more connected to the consequences of the road. Exhaust tone played a big role too. A stock 440 car has a sound that starts deep, then opens up with this hollow roar that feels like it's echoing from the center of the chassis. The Hemi's note is sharper, more violent, like it's punching its way out of the mufflers. Even hearing them today, you can almost place yourself back into the era without trying. Compared to its rivals, the Charger wasn't perfect, but that's part of why it stood out. The GTO Judge had sharper handling. The Chevelle SS had more raw torque in 454 trim. The Mustang Mach-1 had lighter, more agile behavior. The Torino Cobra had underrated strength. But none of them had the Charger's combination of size, shape, sound, and presence. You can almost feel the difference just by standing next to one. The Charger felt big, but not bulky, heavy, but not clumsy, powerful, but not intimidating in a way that pushed people away. It had this grounded confidence, a sense that it didn't need to outspec every rival because the experience itself carried enough emotion. And that's really what this technical deep dive reveals. The numbers matter, sure, but it's the feeling behind those numbers that made the Charger memorable. Every choice, from the engines to the suspension to the exhaust, contributed to an experience that still resonates today. You can hear it. You can picture it. You can almost feel the car settle as the engine wakes up. This wasn't just engineering. This was Dodge giving the Charger one last moment of true mechanical freedom before the era tightened around it. By the time the 1970 Dodge Charger hit the streets, it wasn't just another performance car. It had already become a symbol. You could see it not only in the numbers Dodge was selling, but in the way people reacted when the car rumbled past them. There's a certain energy the Charger carried, one you can almost feel even today when you watch old footage of those streets. In many parts of America, especially in the Midwest and West Coast, the Charger became a statement of freedom. Kids who grew up near busy highways talk about hearing that low V8 rumble drifting across the neighborhood at night. You can almost imagine the sound bouncing off houses, fading into the quiet, leaving this sense of excitement behind. Street racing culture was starting to rise. Not in a big, organized way, but in the small spaces, industrial back roads, long stretches of empty county roads, quiet areas outside towns. And the Charger seemed to fit right into that world. It wasn't the fastest car on paper, but people loved racing with it because of how solid the car felt under them. That feeling of the rear squatting when the throttle opened was part of its character. In places like Detroit, Chicago, and Southern California, seeing a Charger meant something. The wide stance and long nose made it impossible to mistake for anything else. And you can almost picture how people would turn their heads as it drove past, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. It carried personality in a way that felt natural, not forced. And then there's the pop culture angle. Even though the famous Bullet Charger was a 1968 model, the impact of that movie bled directly into how people viewed the 1970 model. The Charger became the car associated with intensity, weight, and presence. That highway chase scene didn't just entertain, it shaped how an entire generation saw Dodge. It's rare for a single movie to make a car feel legendary, but that's exactly what happened. Beyond movies, the Charger began showing up in magazines, posters, and long-form automotive writing. Journalists described the car with a kind of respect that wasn't given freely at the time. Cars were often judged strictly on specs, but with the Charger, writers focused on how it felt. There's something telling when reviewers talk more about a car's presence than its quarter-mile time. Owners played a huge role in shaping this cultural identity. Talk to anyone who had a Charger back then, and their stories always include small sensory details. The smell of hot carburetors, the feeling of the long hood stretching out in front of them, the sound of the exhaust echoing under bridges. These memories have a consistency that shows the Charger wasn't just a machine, it was part of everyday life. Car clubs also started forming around this time. Groups of owners would meet in grocery store parking lots, roadside diners, or small local garages. They'd stand around with folded arms, looking over each other's engines, swapping stories, and sharing small tuning tips. You can almost picture the mix of voices, laughter, and the faint smell of gasoline in the air. What's interesting is how the Charger didn't divide people. Some cars became Ford versus Chevy type of arguments, but the Charger often sat above that. Even people who preferred other brands acknowledged its presence. It had this universal appeal, not because of badges or marketing, but because of how genuine the car felt. It's rare for a muscle car to earn respect across rival camps. And when the 1970 model entered the scene, it carried all that momentum with it. But this specific year brought something different, a sense of finality. People didn't know it at the time, but 1970 would be the last year before the muscle era changed direction. And the Charger became a kind of symbol for that shift. Owners today talk about how the 70 model feels like it has the last open roads spirit baked into it. It's the final version untouched by the big regulatory moves that swept through the industry afterward. Collectors who grew up around these cars often mention how the Charger represented a kind of independence. Not just horsepower independence, but personal independence. You could take it out on a long road without planning too much, without worrying about fuel or restrictions. You can almost feel that atmosphere when you see old photos of Chargers parked at gas stations during road trips. Even decades later, the Charger's cultural footprint remained strong. Movies rediscovered it, TV shows referenced it, video games made it timeless. Younger audiences who weren't even alive during the muscle era still recognized the shape instantly. That says something. It shows the car didn't just leave its mark on its own generation, it echoed forward. And on the roads today, when a 1970 Charger appears at a meet or a weekend show, everything else changes for a moment. People slow down. They angle their heads. They take pictures even if they've seen one before. It's not about rarity, it's about presence. A presence that cannot be replicated. So when we talk about the cultural impact of the 1970 Charger, it's not just about fame or appearances. It's about the way the car made people feel, how it blended with everyday life, how it marked the end of one era and quietly prepared to hand over the keys to another. This wasn't just a car people looked at, It was a car people remembered, in sound, in shape, in spirit. When the muscle era shifted after 1970, the Charger changed with it. Not because Dodge wanted to, but because the world around them forced the evolution. You can almost feel the shift when you compare a 1970 model to what came just a year later. Something in the energy changes. Something in the freedom feels different. By 1971, regulations were tightening. Safety requirements reshaped front-end designs. Emission standards softened engine output. Insurance companies made high-horsepower cars harder to own. It wasn't one big moment. It was a dozen small ones stacking together, quietly rewriting the rules. And that's exactly why the 1970 Charger's legacy feels so strong now. It became the last version built before the compromises, the last one that carried the open-road spirit of the 60s without restrictions, the last one designed from instinct rather than caution. Collectors often talk about this last-moment feeling. When they stand next to a 1970 Charger, even today, there's a strange mix of excitement and calm. The car doesn't try to impress you. It simply exists with confidence. You can almost sense the era in its shape, like it's carrying the memory of a world that doesn't exist anymore. As the decades passed, the Charger's reputation only grew. In the 80s and early 90s, when muscle cars weren't fashionable, the Charger stayed relevant in its own quiet way. People who knew these cars understood what they represented. Even during the years when fuel economy dominated conversations, a 1970 Charger showing up at a local meet still drew attention. It stood out without trying. By the late 90s and early 2000s, something changed again. Restoration culture exploded. Car magazines rediscovered American muscle. Auction prices climbed. Suddenly, everyone wanted the Charger, not because it was trendy, but because people were finally recognizing its place in history. You can almost feel that rediscovery when you watch old videos of barn finds, families pulling dusty Chargers out of storage, realizing what they had been sitting on. Modern enthusiasts talk about the 1970 Charger the way people talk about legends. Not just with admiration, but with a kind of respect, a sense that this car represents the end of something meaningful. And then, Dodge brought the Charger name back in 2006. Not the same shape, not the same layout, but the same spirit. Big power, big attitude, a bold presence. Even though the modern Charger is a four-door, it still carries the genetic memory of the original, especially the Hellcat and Scat Pack variants. You can almost hear echoes of the past in the way those engines sound. It's not the same era, but the energy feels familiar. What's interesting is how younger generations respond to the 1970 Charger. Teenagers who grew up on digital screens, video games, and modern cars still recognize it instantly. The silhouette doesn't need explanation. It speaks for itself. That kind of design longevity is rare. Car clubs still feature it. Movies still use it. Games still celebrate it. And when one appears at a car meet, even among modern supercars, people drift toward it. Not because it's the fastest, but because it has presence. A presence you can't engineer anymore. A presence born from a moment in time. The rise in value over the last 2 decades isn't just about rarity or performance. It's about meaning. The 1970 Charger represents something people don't want to lose. The feeling of a world where cars carried emotion straight from factory to street. Today, when you see one on the road, it doesn't look outdated. It looks timeless. It looks honest. It looks like a machine built with confidence rather than compromise. And that is the legacy the 1970 Charger holds. A car that survived its own era, carried its identity through decades, and became a symbol of the last pure American muscle moment before the industry changed direction. It's more than metal. It's memory, with wheels, sound, and a heartbeat. When you see a 1970 Dodge Charger today, rolling down a street that looks nothing like the roads it was born on, there's a quiet sort of poetry to it. The world has changed. Traffic moves differently, engines sound cleaner, streets feel lighter, but the Charger still carries the weight of its era like a memory pressed into metal. You can almost feel the contrast between the world it came from and the world it moves through now. Back in Section 1, we talked about that early morning road, that quiet stretch of pavement the Charger seemed to own. And as strange as it sounds, ending the story here almost loops back to that same moment. Because the 1970 Charger isn't a car trapped in the past, it's a car that keeps pulling the past forward. Every time it starts, every time it idles, every time it shows up at a meet, the era breathes again for a second. The more you learn about this car, the decisions behind it, the timing, the people, the culture, the more you realize that its legacy isn't built on horsepower alone. It's built on feeling. It's built on the sense that this machine came from the last moment when American muscle cars were allowed to be pure, instinctive, and unapologetically powerful. The 1971 redesign changed everything. Regulations changed everything. Insurance changed everything. You can almost sense that turning point when you stand next to a 1970 model today. It looks like a goodbye and a tribute at the same time. The last breath before the fall, and the clearest expression of what muscle cars were meant to be. What makes the 1970 Charger timeless isn't that it was the fastest or the rarest. It's that it captured a piece of American culture at the exact moment that culture was about to disappear. It froze the spirit of the 60s, the confidence, the noise, the freedom, in a shape that still speaks without saying anything. And that's why the Charger still matters now. Not just to collectors, not just to enthusiasts, but to anyone who understands that machines can carry emotion. When the engine starts, you don't just hear exhaust, you hear an era. When the tires roll, you don't just see movement, you see history. And when the car sits still, you don't just see steel, you see the last pure moment before things changed. That's the story of the 1970 Dodge Charger. Not just a muscle icon, but the final heartbeat of a time America never quite got back.